As summer approaches, at least here in the Northern Hemisphere, I think it's time to start looking at my energy dashboard and getting things set up again the way they're supposed to be. I made a previous video on this and I had some issues with the tariffs and getting those set up, and some stuff has changed since I made that last video. So I'm going to go through and set up some tariffs and get my energy dashboard up to where it's supposed to be so I can monitor my air conditioning and cooling needs and energy usage for the summer. So let's get started. For those unfamiliar with what this is the energy dashboard. And this is something that Home Assistant has now that allows you to measure your usage or consumption. And also, if you're generating power via solar panels or some other method, you can also track that here. So you can actually have energy usage, positive or negative, when you're building out your energy dashboard here. And you would measure it all through integrations or connections to Home Assistant to the energy dashboard. Now, what I'm using is actually this right here. This is the home energy meter, and I have an earlier generation. And what's amazing about it is it's been baking in the sun and freezing in the winter for about 5 or 6 years now. And it's against the wall of the house, and it just basically works. It's ugly looking because it's dirty. It's been out in the elements, but it still functions. It's a Z-Wave device, and it just reports my energy usage real time locally. I don't have to connect to any cloud service or anything else. It picks it up from the power lines going into my main box of my house. I also have the Emporia stuff, which I just removed temporarily because I'm going to be moving to a new house here pretty soon. But I removed that, but it also does report. So what I can do is I can use the AOTech that's on my main lines for my main generation. And I can use the Emporia for measuring stuff internal. And the only reason there's a difference is I have a couple of 240 volt devices that come from the mains, such as my air conditioning and my dryer. And those don't go through the little sub box that's in the house. My Emporia is connected to the sub box. Anyway, I have a number of different ways to measure it. And that's what I use is this AOTech for my main readings. And you can see that here. This is actually coming from my AOTech device here in my my electrical panel. All right, so how do we build this out? Oh, also before I get to that, next step here's water consumption. I use a flume meter, and that is a device that connects to my water meter, and it measures the pulses in the water meter somehow through some sort of magic. And it also shows me my water consumption here. And this is a whole section in Home Assistant on their page talks about, or on their site, talks about how this works. And there's different ways you can connect to your meter depending on what country you live in, and whether or not, or what brand or device you have on your power meter. So you can go through this, and I'll link that down below. It talks about different ways to do that. And then our utility meter is something that we're going to use as a helper in Home Assistant in order to be able to bring this information in. And the reason I'm using that is I want to be able to reset my values on a monthly basis, and or whenever it happens to be. In my case, I'm going to change tariffs between an off-peak and a peak tariff whenever I get to a certain usage of power or kilowatt hours on my meter. In my case, it happens to go up to 600 kilowatt hours. And this is pretty hard to see, but basically, the way my bill works is I have a $9 service availability charge. I have off-peak power usage or charges of 0.07188 per kilowatt hour. And then after I hit 600 kilowatt hours, then I add an additional 0.02060 for 9 something or other. And that's the amount that I'll be charged. And I want to be able to set up an automation to be able to change that. So we're going to get into how we do that now. I'm going to set up a couple of helpers, and I'm going to do that using the utility meter helper. And so let me show you what I just clicked on down here. You click on this create helper down here, and if you want to get to the helper page, you just hit C and type helpers and navigate to helpers here. And then you have a create helper button down here, create helper. And you can see down here that we have at the very bottom utility meter. And the utility meter is how we're going to actually add our consumption to our energy dashboard. Now you can do this in YAML as well. If you have a very complicated setup, and some of you do, I've had questions in the past about tariffs and how many different tariffs there are for some of the different power companies around the world. It's pretty complicated, and I don't know why it has to be that way, but it is. I'm going to call this power consumption. And the input sensor is going to be that AOTech that I'm using, and I have a number of different ones. You want to make sure you're using kilowatt hours. It has to be kilowatt hours or it's not going to work properly. So we'll use that one. I want this one actually. And then my meter reset cycle. This is something that you'll have to work on and figure out from your power company. When does your meter reset? Mine resets monthly. And then there's a meter offset. And this determines how many days from the end of the month it resets. So if it resets on the 15th of the month, for example, you're going to probably want to have an offset of about 15 days. I'm going to leave mine as 0 for now. And then you're going to add any tariffs that you want to use because it's going to create a helper for all the different tariffs. I'm going to have a peak tariff and I'm going to have off-peak tariff. So now you see you have a peak and an off-peak tariff. If you have the ability to generate electricity, you probably want to have net consumption enabled. This means that your meter can both increase and decrease. I'm not generating any power locally, so I'm going to leave it as off. And then if you have source values or delta values since the last reading instead of absolute values, you want to turn this one on. Again, I'm going to leave that off. Now, once you do this and you create more than one tariff, some interesting things are going to happen. So I'm going to submit this. And you're going to see now that we have power consumption as a select. That's what you'll use in your automation. Power consumption off-peak, that is the off-peak value. And then power consumption peak. And that is the peak value that you're going to use in order to set up your energy meter. Now, again, there are different ways to do this. You can do this in YAML. You can also create a template that sets the values or the costs for each of your different types of setups here. So we're going to create one more helper here. Just click on the Create Helper button. We're going to go down here and we're going to click on Utility Meter again. This will be total power consumption. Input center will be the same as what we used before. That's going to be our G2. Again, make sure you use kilowatt hours for that. Meter reset cycle, the same as my peak and off peak. Supported tariffs, we're going to leave this blank because with the supported tariffs blank, it's only going to create one utility helper. And this is a utility helper that's going to continue to accumulate or collect the values over the entire month and then reset. So we want to know when we get to 600 kilowatt hours. So in our automation, we can set that. So everything else stays the same. And you can see that it's created only one total power consumption. It doesn't have the off-peak, peak, or the selector for this one because we're using this just as a total. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to go into our our energy meter. So you can again hit C key, energy configuration, and we're going to start adding things under add consumption here. Before we actually add our first consumption, let me just talk about something real quick. When I first added those helpers in both my Home Assistant Blue and my Home Assistant Yellow, when I was playing around with this, they didn't show up as an available helper or an available energy item in the consumption. I had to actually reboot Home Assistant to make that work or have them show up. So if you don't see them in there, when you're trying to add them under consumption here, make sure that you reboot Home Assistant and then they should show up. I don't know what the issue is with that. Maybe I didn't wait long enough once I created the helper. I don't know, but they're in here now. I didn't reboot this time. So we do have power consumption off peak, power consumption peak. And then total power consumption, again, we're not using that because we're going to use that only in the automation. So I'm going to add two different things. I'm going to add the off peak and I'm going to add the peak. And for each one of these things, I am going to use a static price. My tariffs are easy enough that once I hit 600 kilowatt hours, I automatically switch it to the peak and then it starts calculating from there. So I'm going to just set a static price because I know the static price for peak and off peak. And let me show you again what I'm talking about. Peak is going to be this number plus this other number, and I need to add those up real quick. So let me do that. We will take and add the peak, invalid input, nice. We will add the peak, so 0 or 0.07188 plus 0.02 or 0.02. 0.060 gives us a peak rate of 0.09248. So I will just copy that and I will put that in the settings for the static here and save that. And this is our peak price. And then I'm going to add another, or I'm sorry, that's off-peak price. So I need to change that. Let's edit that and make that peak instead of off-peak. So that is peak, and that's the peak price. And then we will add the off-peak. So off-peak. Power consumption off-peak is this right here. And again, static price, and this is going to be the static price here, which is the 0.07188. I'll just copy that and put it in here. And that's our off-peak price. And you're going to get your total grid price by putting both of those in here. Now let's go over to Developer Tools. And I'm going to look at where we're setting for the select. So I'm going to go to States and Power Consumption. And right now we're selected for peak. I want to turn that off, or not turn it off. I don't want to set it for off-peak. And we've changed to off-peak. It should start with off-peak. It's probably because I added peak first or whatever. Not sure why it automatically defaults to peak. But we're currently in an off-peak because my total usage is less than 600 kilowatt hours. One other point to make here is if you set this stuff up in the middle of the month, you're going to have to wait for the new month or the new reset cycle for it to actually start calculating properly. If you have an energy meter that's giving you the information and it's up to date, you're going to have a better chance of getting the right value at the right time. For example, if you have an energy company that allows you to see your rate and it shows you the current rate, then you're going to be able to go from that point forward. However, in my case, where I'm using a sensor inside my electrical box outside, I'm not actually starting to collect anything until I set it up, which is right now. So all of my values, and you can see those here, my off-peak value is 0.04, and my peak value is 0.59 because it sat there for a few minutes before I actually switched it over. So you're going to see improper values until you let it cycle through an entire cycle or start with a new cycle, which would be the new month or new whatever time frame you're using. So just keep that in mind. You can also see here that the status of the off-peak is collecting and the status of the peak is paused. So right now, this is the sensor that is collecting data for the month until I set the automation up and it switches it over to the peak, which then would say this collecting and this would be paused. All right, so back over here to our energy dashboard, and let's just take a look at what we have. We do have power consumption peak and power consumption off peak, and we have a grid total here of 0.12. So you can see here where it's sat for a few minutes under peak, and now it's under off peak, and it'll take some time for it to update that. And with that, that is how I set up my stuff. So now let's go over to automations and let's set up the automation to switch this to peak whenever it hits 600 kilowatt hours. So create automation. It's going to be a new automation. I'm going to add a trigger, and it's going to be a numeric state because I want to know the numeric state of that collector or that entity. And the entity is total power consumption. Remember, we created total power consumption as just an accumulator of the total amount of kilowatt hours. It doesn't care what the price is. All it cares about is it's collecting that value, and it will reset on the first of every month. I'm going to set it for above a fixed number, and I want it above 600. When it reaches 600 kilowatt hours, then it will do the action. And my action is going to be a service, and this service is going to be a select option. And I'm going to set options. So it's not input select. Let me find the other one, select option. It is select option. Don't use input select option. Use select option. And then you're going to choose the entity. In this case, power consumption This is the select that was created. Remember, it created those 3 helpers. When I create one helper with more than one tariff for utility meter, it creates this select as well. So I'll click on that. And then I want to tell it what to select. So I want it to select peak. You gotta make sure you tell it which one to select. And then I can save it. And I'm gonna give it a name, set peak power, or peak rate. I'm just gonna call it set peak rate. Save that. And now you can just kind of look at it in YAML if you want to see what it does. So the trigger is a numeric state. In the total power consumption is above 600. It will select the option to peak and select power consumption. Or it'll set the power consumption to peak, and then at that point, it will switch it over to the peak rate. And then in your energy meter, you'll actually start seeing the peak rate show up being collected here rather than the off-peak rate. Now remember, if you have peak rates that happen during different times of the day, then you would come over here and you would set some other conditions. You would have to set up a different automation or a different type of automation that would set the, rather than it being when the consumption is above 600, for example, you would just do it on a time. So when the time is equal to whatever, you would change it to the peak, and then you would set it back to non-peak at midnight or whatever the case may be. So there's different ways to do that. Just depends on your automation. So one of the things I mentioned before is it's not real time. Well, what if we want to look at our real-time current energy usage and our costing? Well, we can go over to our dashboard here, and I created a couple of things over here. There just happen to be bar charts or bar graphs or whatever in Home Assistant. It's a card. It shows me my current energy, and that's 687 watts that it's currently running off of the meter or off of that AOTech sensor. And this is my total cost for the day. And the way I did the total cost was I created a template sensor that actually added up both the off-peak and the peak. And you can see that here, maybe. And so what I've done over here is, let's make this smaller so you can see it, is I created this sensor, and this is the total energy cost. The unit of measurement is dollars, and I commented those out. But the value template basically says the monthly energy peak cost plus the monthly energy off-peak cost. That is the value of the Buck Creek total energy cost. Remember, this is my production system, so the sensors names are different, but it's the same concept. I created this in my sensors file, which I referenced from my configuration. You can put it in your configuration file as well. And then with this right here, it will give you the value that you want for this total energy cost. So, get out of the way there. $2.86 so far. Remember, I also started this mid-month, so it's not going to be completely accurate. That's not what my current monthly cost has been for my energy consumption. But anyway, this is the energy dashboard, and it's a really neat way to show energy usage. And you can get into things like, let me show you here. We go back to the energy dashboard. I do have one plug here. It's my freezer plug. I've used 1/4 kilowatt hour, so 260 watts of power for my freezer plug just for today. If you switch it to week, you will see that I've used about 2.8 kilowatts of energy just for my freezer plug. Now, these devices on here will show up in the energy dashboard if they're energy devices that Home Assistant recognizes. All right, well, if you have any questions about the energy meter, let me know in the comments down below. Tariffs are hard. Tariffs are complicated. Tariffs are terrible. I don't know what the purpose of a tariff is. For example, I mean, I could potentially lower my energy costs if my tariff were to go super high based on my usage. Most people that I know anyway don't stare at their energy costs and say, okay, I'm not going to run my dishwasher or my washing machine or my dryer or my air conditioning after I hit 600 kilowatt hours for the month. because I'm going to do that in about, I don't know, mid-month. And then I have none of that stuff, right? There are some regions, areas where power is super expensive and you can actually get your energy usage or your cost lower if you run certain appliances during the time when the off-peak tariff is in place. Those are valuable, or those work well when you have an off-peak versus peak that's based on time of day. If my peak is between 3 and 10 p.m. every day, I want to run everything in the morning. But my peak only happens when I hit 600 kilowatt hours. So it really doesn't matter for me to determine when to run my appliances, because they're going to cost the same until I hit that threshold. Anyway, again, tariffs are hard and terrible and awful and messy. And that just makes things more complicated when you're trying to do something like the energy dashboard. All right, that's going to do it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you're not a subscriber, would you do me a favor and just hit that button down below? And if you want to join the channel and support what I do, you can also do that down below. Comments and Discord and everything else. I will do what I can to respond to those when I can. So we'll see you on the next one.